The meeting was supposed to be about money. It was the spring of 1988. Medellin was burning. Not metaphorically, not politically, but literally. Car bombs, assassinations. Police officers found face down in gutters before sunrise. The Colombian government was hemorrhaging credibility, and the cartels were hemorrhaging patience with each other. Someone had to sit down. Someone had to draw lines. The location was a finca outside Cali, neutral enough to be acceptable, close enough to Cali territory to signal who held the real leverage. The house belonged to a businessman whose name appeared on no wanted list, a man who moved between worlds with practiced ease, the kind of man both sides needed, but neither side fully trusted. Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela arrived first. That detail mattered. In the world these men inhabited, who arrived first was a declaration. It said, "I am not afraid of this place." It said, "I control this meeting." Gilberto knew this. He had spent years building the Cali Cartel into something that looked, from the outside, almost respectable. His people wore suits. They attended charity dinners. They cultivated relationships with politicians through envelopes rather than threats. They called themselves businessmen, and they said it without irony. Gilberto was 49 years old that spring. He had a banker's face, composed, watchful, giving away nothing unless he chose to give it. He sat at the head of the long wooden table in the Finch's main room and accepted a glass of water from the housekeeper without looking at her. His brother Miguel sat to his left. 3 other men from Cali's inner circle took positions along the table, each one calibrated in their stillness. They waited. Pablo Escobar arrived 22 minutes late. He came with 4 men, not 20. That surprised the Cali delegation. They had expected a procession, a display. Escobar was known for theatrics, for making entrances that filled rooms before he physically occupied them. Instead, he walked in wearing dark trousers and a plain white shirt, slightly wrinkled at the collar. No jacket. His hair was damp, as though he had showered recently and not fully dried it. He was 38 years old, and he looked like a man who had just come from somewhere else entirely and had not given this meeting much thought. He sat down across from Gilberto without greeting anyone. One of the Cali men later described the moment. He said it was like watching someone sit down at the wrong table in a restaurant. Unbothered, unhurried, slightly out of place in a way that made everyone else feel out of place instead. Gilberto spoke first. He always spoke first. He laid out the situation with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this many times and had decided to sound as though he hadn't. The violence in Medellin was becoming a problem for everyone, he said. Not just for the government, not just for the Americans who were now sending advisors and money, but for the business itself. Attention was the enemy of profit. Pablo's methods, the bombings, the public assassinations, the war against extradition fought with bodies in the streets, were attracting the kind of attention that made quiet commerce impossible. "There is a way to do this that doesn't look like what you're doing," Gilberto said. His voice was even, almost paternal. "We have built relationships. We have built systems. What you have built is a war." Escobar said nothing. He was looking at a point somewhere above Gilberto's left shoulder. His hands were flat on the table, still. His expression was not hostile. It was not engaged. It was the expression of a man sitting through something he had already decided the outcome of. Miguel leaned forward slightly. He had always been the more aggressive of the 2 brothers, quicker to edge, quicker to show it. "The problem," Miguel said, "is style. You come from Envigado. You think like Envigado, a village, a neighborhood. You have made yourself a neighborhood problem, and now it is everyone's problem." Gilberto touched his brother's arm. Barely, just the fingertips. Miguel settled back. "What we are suggesting," Gilberto continued, "is a different kind of power, quieter, more durable. The kind that does not require you to burn down half the country every time someone disappoints you." The room was very still. Outside, somewhere beyond the finca's high walls, a bird was making a sound in the late afternoon heat. One of the Cali men adjusted his watch. The housekeeper had not returned. Escobar looked at Gilberto for the first time since sitting down. He said, "Are you finished?" Gilberto held his gaze. "For now." Escobar nodded once. He stood up. He said nothing to the men along the table. He looked at Gilberto for another moment, not with anger, not with contempt, just with a kind of flat attention, the look of a man cataloging information. And then he walked out. His four men followed. The meeting had lasted 11 minutes. Miguel watched the door. Then he said quietly, to no one in particular. He understood nothing. But Gilberto did not respond. He was still looking at the door. His glass of water sat untouched in front of him. Something had shifted in his face that the other men in the room could not quite name, and he did not explain it, and no one asked. On the drive back to Medellin, Escobar said very little. One of the men who accompanied him that day, a man whose name has been kept out of every official account, later described the journey to a journalist in the late 90s. They had driven for nearly 2 hours through mountain roads, the windows cracked, the air cooling as the altitude rose. Escobar had sat in the back seat and looked at the landscape. At one point, somewhere in the mountains between the two cities, he had asked for the radio to be turned on. A vallenato song was playing, something old, something the driver recognized but couldn't name. Escobar had listened to it for a few minutes without speaking. Then he had turned to the window again. That was all. The man telling the story said he had expected on that drive to be given instructions, plans, some indication of what came next. He had been in rooms with Escobar many times during confrontations and provocations, and there was usually a moment, on the way out or in the car or back at the house, when the tension resolved into action, when the silence became a sentence. This time, it never did. He seemed, the man said, searching for the word, satisfied, not happy, not agitated, just satisfied, in the way a man is satisfied after completing a task he had been thinking about for a long time, as though the meeting itself, those 11 minutes, had given him exactly what he had gone to get, and now the matter was settled in a way that only he could see. In the weeks that followed, the Cali delegation waited. They had expected a response. In their experience, men like Escobar always responded, loudly, immediately, in ways that could be tracked and anticipated. That was the predictability of his method, and it was also, they believed, its weakness. A man who always moved the same way could be read. A man who could be read could be managed. But Escobar did not respond. He gave no interviews. He sent no messages. The Medellin cartel's operations continued, but nothing pointed back toward Cali specifically. There were no escalations. There were no concessions. It was as though the meeting at the finca had not occurred, as though those 11 minutes had simply been absorbed into the air of that room and dissolved. One of Gilberto's lieutenants told him this was good news. He's afraid, the man said. He knows he can't touch us directly. This is him backing down. Gilberto listened to this and said nothing. He was not a superstitious man. He did not believe in signs or atmospheres or the invisible weight that certain silences carry. He had built his empire on rationality, on systems, on the premise that every man, no matter how violent, no matter how irrational he appeared, was ultimately operating from a comprehensible logic. Find the logic and you find the leverage. But he could not find Escobar's logic in the silence. And that absence, the absence of a readable response, was something Gilberto had not prepared for. 3 months later, in August of that year, a series of events unfolded across Medellin that the newspapers would spend weeks trying to explain. It was not a bombing. It was not an assassination. It was quieter than that and far more precise. A network that Cali had spent 2 years building inside Medellin, informants, contacts, men positioned in neighborhoods and police stations and municipal offices, collapsed in the space of 72 hours. Not violently, simply gone. Men stopped returning calls, safe houses emptied. Arrangements that had been reliable for years became unreliable overnight. No one claimed responsibility. There were no bodies, no messages, no declaration, just the sudden, total absence of something that had been there before. It took Cali's people 3 weeks to understand the full scope of what had happened, another 2 weeks to confirm that it had been deliberate. And even then, there was no proof that could be pointed to, no thread that led back to a single decision made in a single room. It was like trying to trace the source of a fog. Gilberto received the reports in his office in Cali and read each one carefully. He asked clarifying questions. He waited for new information. He did not, in front of his people, show anything that could be interpreted as alarm. But at night, in his house, sitting in the chair by the window he favored when he could not sleep, he returned to that room at the finca, to those 11 minutes, to the way Escobar had looked at him when he stood up to leave. That flat attention, that look of a man who had already done the arithmetic and found it satisfactory. He had called Escobar a peasant, more or less. He had said it carefully in the language of suggestion and implication, but he had said it. He had assumed that a man who came from where Escobar came from, who thought the way Escobar thought, who operated with the bluntness and fury that Escobar operated with, would respond with bluntness and fury. He had assumed that Escobar would show him what he planned to do. He had not understood that Escobar would simply do it. In 1995, Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela was arrested in Cali following a tip that Colombian authorities later confirmed came from a source within his own organization. He was extradited to the United States in 2004 and eventually pleaded guilty to drug trafficking charges. He has been imprisoned since. Escobar was dead by then, killed in December 1993. In 2009, a Colombian journalist named Rodrigo Pardo conducted a series of interviews with former cartel figures for a long-form project on the drug war years. One of those interviews, conducted over 2 sessions at a federal facility in the United States, was with Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela. Pardo asked him about that meeting in 1988. He had heard about it through other sources, through the layered oral history that circulates among men who survived those years and those who documented them. Gilberto was quiet for a long time before answering. "We thought he was simple," Gilberto finally said. "That was the mistake. Not the only mistake, but the first one. We saw the violence and we thought we understood the man. We thought they were the same thing. We were wrong," Pardo asked him to explain. "The violence was not who he was," Gilberto said. "The violence was what he chose when it served him. When it didn't serve him, he chose something else. We were never able to predict what that something else would be. That was the problem." Pardo asked about the meeting specifically, about those 11 minutes. Another silence. "He came in and he sat down," Gilberto said, "and I understood immediately that I had already made an error. I had assumed that calling that meeting was an act of strength. I thought I was setting the terms, but he walked in and I could feel that for him the meeting was already over. He had already decided. We were speaking, and he was not listening, because he had already heard everything he needed to hear before he arrived." "What had he heard?" "That we thought he was manageable," Gilberto said, "that we had underestimated him. Once he knew that, he didn't need anything else from us." Pardo asked one final question. What Gilberto thought about when he thought about Escobar now. The old man looked at the wall of the interview room for a moment. "I think about that meeting," he said. 11 minutes. I spoke for most of them. I said many things. He said almost nothing. A pause. "I have spent a long time thinking about what I said. I have spent almost no time thinking about what he said. There was nothing to think about." Another pause, longer this time. "That should have told me everything." The finca outside Cali no longer exists. It was demolished in the early 90s and the land was sold. The businessman who owned it left Colombia in 1990 and died in Spain in 2003. The housekeeper, if she remembered that afternoon, never said so publicly. Of the men who sat in that room in the spring of 1988, most are dead or in prison. The bird that made a sound beyond the walls, whatever it was, wherever it went, left no record. Only the silence remains. The 11 minutes of it, the way it filled a room, followed a man back to Cali and waited there, patient and without announcement, until it became everything he had left to think about. Escobar had not argued. He had not threatened. He had not explained himself or defended himself or demonstrated himself. He had sat down, looked at a point above a man's shoulder, and then stood up and walked out. The room did the rest. It always does. That is how it worked with him. Not through announcements, not through demonstrations, through the particular weight of a man who had already decided, walking into a room full of men who hadn't yet. They felt it. They could not name it. By the time they understood it, the room was empty, and the silence had already traveled the 2 hours back to Medellin and settled into place, waiting to become the next thing none of them would see coming.